Hello, it's Amy, and I'm back again with Volume 2 of the Memoirs of the Princesse de Ligne. And we are beginning Chapter 5, which is in Volume 2, but it is Part 2 of the work. For whatever reason, I guess because of how it divided, Part 2 actually began in Volume 1, which is just tucked on the shelf there behind me. And so we are on Chapter 5 of Part 2. And you'll recall from the last reading that Helene had just gotten married. The young couple first established themselves at Belle-Île, the magnificent summer residence of the Prince de Ligne. The Marshal was passionately attached to this regal abode, on which his father had lavished several millions. The property was composed of a succession of gardens, forests, parks, mansions, and shooting boxes, which the Prince de Ligne had designed with the most perfect taste. Now, I don't know what a shooting box is, but I'm going to assume it has something to do with hunting. Perhaps a shooting box is something you would sit in while you're waiting to hunt. The way you would sit waiting for ducks or something along those lines. Designed with the most perfect taste. It was here that he preferred receiving his guests, and that he successively entertained the Prince de Conde and the King of Sweden, the Count d'Artois, Prince Henry of Prussia, etc. Helene was dazzled by the splendor of her new abode. A brilliant reception had been prepared in her honor. On the very day after her arrival, which had taken place in the evening, the young princess, on opening her windows, perceived an immense park full of villagers, elegantly attired as shepherds and shepherdesses, their dresses more like those of Watteau and Lancret than those commonly worn by the Flemish peasants. The prince's dragoons were making merry at the tables on the lawn, and a little farther off in a grove might be seen puppet shows. In another, tightrope dancers. A rural ballroom was established on a green sward. Under a leafy bower, a magician was distributing sham ointments in little boxes which contained sweetmeats and trinkets. In another spot, a bard was gaily reciting verses composed by the prince in honor of the newly married pair, and if the composition was not brilliant in versification, it yet could boast of grace and art sufficient to compensate for its defects. Finally, Offrance and Preval, who had arrived that same morning from Paris, were playing improvised proverbs in the private theatre of the residence. What a party to wake up to! And I'm assuming the villagers dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses. Perhaps they actually are. And this is some sort of formal dress, or I guess I would judge by the tone here. Perhaps this was some special costume that was designed for this exact moment to create the image of it for her. The festivities lasted the whole day. After dinner, the proverbs were replaced by a comedy in one act with interludes of song entitled Colette and Lucas, composed by the Prince de Ligne in honor of his daughter-in-law. And we have a footnote. The comedy was printed in the private press at Belle-Île in 1781. The only copy known to be extant is in H.R.H., the Duc d'Aumale's library at Chantilly. And I suppose that was common back in the day for the wealthy to, publish their own works. Although I do find it interesting that it's the Prince de Ligne himself who's written this, composed it for his daughter-in-law, rather than hiring perhaps some famous artist to do it. The audience was composed of brilliant officers and fine ladies who had come expressly from Brussels and even Versailles for the occasion. The play, though worthless, was courteously applauded. I was about to question the quality of it, considering he's not a famous playwright. But another had been prepared in order to compensate the spectators. Damn, she's harsh. Night having come on during the representation, sudden floods of light, springing up in brilliant sheaves between the green trees, greeted the guests as they emerged from the theatre, and in the thickets, fairy-like illuminations lit up the arbours. It was impossible to see the lamps, cleverly hidden under the foliage. It was not night, says Helene, it was silvery daylight. The married couple appeared enchanted, one with the other, with a shade more of tenderness on the part of the prince. Helene's beauty, grace, and intelligence surprised and charmed him. He had not expected to find these qualities united in the person of a child of 15. Everyone was under the same impression, and the dowager princess herself, who was not easy to please, wrote as follows, some time after the wedding to the Princesse de Ligne Luxembourg. From Belle-Île, 20th August, 1779. Again, I renew my thanks, Princess, and reiterate the expressions of gratitude I owe you. Our child is most charming, docile, and gentle, having no will of her own, and amused at everything. In fact, all that could be desired in a daughter-in-law if she were moulded by oneself. She has been quite a success with all who have seen her in these parts. As our children have both had the honour of writing to you, I will not, for fear of repetition, give you the details of our journey. Moreover, His Grace the Bishop of Wilna will have told you all. He appeared himself very well pleased with our country. Do try, Princess, to make him send my son his niece's portrait, in whatever style he prefers, even if it be that little pencil drawing we saw at the Abbaye aux Bois. And do not doubt, Princess, of the tender sentiments, etc., etc. And you can well imagine that this grand, large party was probably well recorded in, the letters, the correspondence, the diaries and journals of the guests, because it certainly sounds like it was an occasion. The Prince Bishop had indeed been delighted with his stay in Flanders. The amiability of the family at Ligne, the harmonious relationship existing between its members, the distinguished intelligence and the kindness of Prince Charles in particular, all contributed to assure him of his niece's future happiness. He left her thoroughly satisfied. For the first time, Helene was going to be acquainted with family life. She could not have had a better beginning, for the Lynnes lived together with an intimacy full of ease, gaiety, and tenderness. In her convent life, the little princess, with the selfishness natural to children, had only thought of herself, and was not accustomed to the daily sacrifices made by brothers and sisters, which are made easy and rewarded by a mother's approval and kiss. She had a serious apprenticeship to undergo. She preferred her father-in-law and the Princess Clary, her sister-in-law, to all the other members of the family. The Princess Clary, the prince's eldest and favourite daughter, his masterpiece, as he called her, was kindness, grace, and affability itself. Married some 4 years, gifted with sound judgment and perfect tact, she would have been an affectionate and charming guide to her young sister-in-law at the outset of her married life. But it was not possible for her to assume this position, which naturally devolved upon the prince's mother, who, jealous of her rights, would have ceded her authority to no one. The Princess de Ligne played an important part, if not in the heart of her husband, at least in his household. The prince willingly rendered justice to his wife's qualities. It was full of consideration for her. He was full of consideration for her, and treated her always with amiable deference. My wife, he said, is an excellent wife, full of delicacy, feeling, nobility, and in no way selfish. She is often in a pet. Often in a pet. I wonder what that means. She is often in a pet, but her temper soon passes away, melting in tears and leaving no trace, for my wife has an excellent heart. So often in a pet, that seems to mean something along the lines of often in, often in a tiff, often disgruntled, often annoyed. She's often annoyed and perhaps a little bit petty and angry. But her temper soon passes away, melting in tears and leaving no trace. It was not difficult for the prince to resign himself to his wife's temper, for it affected him very slightly. Such was not the case with her children. It must, however, be admitted that she had often good cause for her unevenness of temper. Not only was her husband constantly and openly faithless to her, but he also squandered his fortune, and in spite of the large revenues he possessed, would often have been involved in serious difficulties had it not been for the watchful care of the princess, who, by her clever administration established a proper balance between their income and expenditure. However, in spite of the princess's rather uncertain temper, the unvarying cheerfulness and good humor of the prince made it a delightful home, for he possessed the rare quality of being as charming at home as in society. That's some biting commentary right there. Not just about the couple, but I think about society as well. Helene thoroughly enjoyed her new life and eagerly threw herself into the pursuit of pleasures entirely new to a little schoolgirl. She at once learnt to ride, dressed in an elegant riding habit made to display her delicate and supple figure to perfection, and accompanied by her husband, she would spring into the saddle the first thing in the morning, as light as a bird, and as pleased with her liberty. Then, 3 or 4 times a day, with childlike glee, she would array herself in new dresses from Leonard or Mademoiselle Bertin, and we may be sure that they in no way resembled the little black convent frock. At all the entertainments given in honor of her wedding, she fascinated everybody by her grace and liveliness. She danced with such spirit, acted so naturally and with so much animation, sang with a voice so youthful and fresh, that her husband, though not sharing her worldly tastes, was happy in her pleasures and allowed her to give herself up to it without restraint. Immediately after her arrival, Helene was presented at the court of the Netherlands. The Ligne family possessed a magnificent palace at Brussels, near the Cathedral of St. Guld, and often resided there during the winter. At that time, the viceroy was Prince Charles of Lorraine. He had married the Archduchess Marie Anne, sister of Marie Therese, and was now a widower. And we have a footnote here. I'm just trying to see. Okay, so the footnote here refers to the Prince Charles of Lorraine and the Archduchess Marie Anne. The brave and clever prince was a most unfortunate general. Beaten by the Prussians in 1742 while commanding the Austrian army in Bohemia, he was again defeated in Alsace in 1745. The affability of his manners, his artistic and literary tastes, his kindness of heart endeared him to all, and his paternal rule is still remembered in Belgium. His generosity was boundless, and the considerable income he received, 600,000 florins of Brabant, did not suffice to cover his expenses. He ruined himself by his prodigality, but science and art prospered under him, and schools of paintings and colleges were established in every town. New roads were made, trade, then in a low ebb, received a fresh impulse, and a transport service was organized between the Flemish ports and those of Germany and France. So that footnote has nothing but positive things to say about him, well, except for, I suppose, his inability to be frugal. The Prince of Lorraine often came to hunt at Belle-Île. He could not help being kind, even in his fits of temper, which were rare. One day, for instance, while hunting, on which occasion he gave himself the airs of an old huntsman, enraged at a number of people who disturbed the hunt by overturning the forest at Belle-Île, he called out, "Go to the devil, if you please, gentlemen," he added, taking off his hat. The liveliest, wittiest, and most fashionable man at the court of Brussels was certainly the Prince de Ligne's father, and he enjoyed his life there extremely. It was, he says, a nice court, gay, and at the same time secure, idle, and agreeable, with plenty of drinking and hunting. However, when the Duke held a levee and invited ladies, nothing but the most inoffensive gaiety was permitted, for the prince hated all license and bad taste. Prince Charles's palace at Brussels was an immense and ancient building. Brussels reminded one somewhat of Paris, the town offering every kind of resource. The Cours was the favorite promenade, and there the grandest equipages were to be seen. The coach builders at Brussels were famous, and the Duke was anxious that the nobility should possess the most elegant specimens of their work. Helene made her first appearance on the Cours in a superb gilt coach made by Simon. All the panels were delicately painted in the most beautiful vernis Martin by clever Viennese artists. And it says in a footnote, a species of lacquer painting at present revived in France. And I suppose the present would be probably the late 19th century when this was published, because that's what the footnotes seem to refer to throughout, and I've been skipping them a lot because they would really mean nothing to us now unless we do additional conversions. But whenever a money amount is mentioned, whenever currency is mentioned, there is a footnote that gives a conversion rate for what it would have been at the time of publication in the late 19th century. Now, of course, here we are more than 100 years later, and that conversion rate would no longer hold true. And I suppose if someone really wanted to, they could take all the currency amounts here and run them through one of those online currency converters and see exactly what it would be worth today. But some of these amounts, in the 1700s seem fairly high, even by today's standards. And so you can only imagine what that would be worth in today's currency. What some of these wedding gifts in the last chapter, would have cost in euros today. But moving on. In spite of his love for the court of Brussels and his passion for Belle-Île, the prince never stayed very long at either. He generally started off at a moment's notice. What a charming existence mine was in my dear and delightful Belle-Île. In 24 hours' time I could be either in Paris or in London, at The Hague, at Spa, etc. Once I went to Paris to spend 1 hour there and another hour at Versailles after the Queen's last confinement. I saw her on the 4th day, he carefully adds. On another occasion I took all my company there to the opera in a coach of my own. It was natural that the prince should like Paris and Versailles, for he was the soul and life of the little intimate circle around the Queen. His presence gave animation to everything, and his invariable good humour and sallies of wit always secured him a smiling welcome. He was to be seen everywhere, arranging or disarranging the gardens, presiding at entertainments and directing the illuminations. He took part in the Queen's Lasquinette, Madame's Calvinoles, Monsieur's Whists, Prince de Condé's Kens, and the King's game of billiards, and the Prince de Conti's Pharaon. And we have a footnote here that says all different games of cards in vogue at the time of the French court. And that is why I did not recognize most of those words there. But Pharaon, Pharaon, billiards, definitely. Kens, which I guess that's 15, the Prince de Condé's 15. And Cavanole. Cavanole does kind of ring a bell, so perhaps that is still a card game today. Cavago, Cavagnole, and Whist, Whist, which apparently are all card games. He said everything that came into his head, but although he gave way too much exaggerated merriment from time to time, under cover of a joke, he would make many serious truths acceptable. His great friends were the Polignacs, and we have another footnote here, Polignac, as in Polignacs, the Duchess de Polignac, Gabrielle Yolande Martin de Polstron, an intimate friend of the Queen, was both amiable and beautiful, expressive blue eyes, a high forehead, a nose very slightly turned up, a lovely mouth with pretty little white teeth, which were beautifully symmetrical, formed a most agreeable physiognomy. Her features bore the stamp of sweetness and modesty. At the age of 17, she married the Count Jules de Polignac. And how interesting to comment on the symmetry and whiteness of her teeth. I'm sure that was a great mark of beauty at the time. I mean, it still is today. We all appreciate, in terms of beauty, facial symmetry and good teeth, but it's not something you compliment someone on. You don't You don't, look at, your favorite singer and say, wow, he's gorgeous, he has great teeth. That's just not something you do. But moving on. His great friends were the Polignacs, whose intimate society consisted of the Connies, the Conflans, and the Count de Vaudreuil, and the Chevalier de Isle. He always defended the Polignacs against the numerous accusations which were brought against them. He writes, "There is no one more virtuous and more disinterested than all these jewels, but their company was sometimes monotonous. So great was their fear of giving rise to prating and gossip. The Countess Diane was the only one whose conversation was at all lively." The prince was particularly intimate with the Chevalier de Isle, the least known member of the little circle. The Chevalier was an excellent officer, an encyclopedist, and a poet, a correspondent of Voltaire. And a footnote here says it was he who also wrote a letter to the Patriarch of Ferney about a badly executed commission commencing as follows: "You must, sir, be very stupid." This beginning threw Voltaire into an ecstasy of delight. He was a master of song and reigned supreme in the art of letter writing. He had never composed a faulty verse or written a letter that was not both witty and in excellent style. However, in society he was wanting both in good taste and breeding, and giving way to ill temper and familiarity, so as to make believe that he dined with the Queen at the Polignacs on Sundays. He would arrive the first after dinner, that those who came after him should be deceived by this maneuver. He wrote regularly to the prince about all that went on at Versailles during his absence. The following is an example of his letters. 16 January 1780. What a turkey we have just eaten at the Countess Diane's. My goodness, what a fine bird. Monsieur de Poix had sent it from the poultry yard. There were 8 of us round it, the lady of the house, Madame de Comtesse Jules, Madame de Henin, and Madame de la Force, Monsieur le Comte d'Artos, Monsieur de Vaudreuil, the Chevalier de Crussol, and myself. Well, we were eating the turkey, but without reference to it. Someone mentioned you, my prince. Let me recall who it was. A lady? No. A man? Yes, certainly a man, for he said Charlotte, and our ladies are not given to such familiarities. It was the man who was on Madame la Countess Jules' left hand. Let me see. I was next to the poet. Here sat the Chevalier de Crussol, and there Monsieur de Vaudreuil, and then, now I've got it. It was Monsieur le Count d'Artos. Yes, I am sure of it now, he said. By the by, who can tell me if Charlotte had arrived at Brussels? I can, your highness, for I have received 4 lines in his own handwriting, and am myself going to write to him. Who has any messages to send? All immediately answered in a chorus, I have. In the confusion I could distinguish these words, I embrace him, I love him. Tell him to come, we expect him. When the hubbub had subsided, the soft voice of Madame la Comtesse Jules commenced more audibly. Tell him that if he had dated his last letter more distinctly, I would not have failed to answer it. But that, although assisted by several experts in the art of deciphering, it was impossible for me even to suspect from what place it had been written, and consequently to what place I should direct my own. Thereupon we conversed about you, and then about Admiral Keppel, then of the turkey, then of the capture of our 2 frigates, then of the Spanish Inquisition, then of a large Gruyere cheese which our ambassador in Switzerland has just sent his children, then of the strange conduct of the Spaniards towards us, and at last of Mademoiselle Theodore, who upon my life dances better than ever, and who pleased us yesterday as much by her talent as Mademoiselle Cecil by her youthful charms. Tomorrow the Queen will receive for the first time. Till now she has only seen those who have the petite entrées. She is rather thinner, but otherwise her health leaves nothing to be desired. The King is still the good husband, the good father, the good man he has always been. It is impossible to be near him without admiring him as the personification of honesty and without being sincerely attached to his person. I assure you we are fortunate in possessing such a royal couple. May God preserve them on the throne where his goodness has placed them. We are all going tomorrow to Paris to inaugurate the charming little house Monsieur le Duc de Coligny has bought, and in which we shall have— what do you think we shall have? Our first grand entertainment, a regular housewarming. We shall have farces, proverbs, verses, songs, and pleasures of all kinds. It will be a beautiful ceremony. Apropos of verse, you have not seen these I wrote the other day for the Queen, threatening to play her the trick that she most dreads, that is, to name her at the opera ball. Here it is. Dans ce temple où l'incognito règne avec la folie, vous n'êtes grâce au domino, ni reine en jolie. Sous ce double déguisement, rien d'être ignoré, je vous nomme et publiquement vous serez adoré. And here we go in a footnote. The English translation to the French I just stumbled through. In this temple, where incognito reigns as well as folly, you are, thanks to the domino, neither queen nor beauty. Under this twofold disguise, laughingly unknown, should I name you, then at once you will be publicly adored. I implore you, Prince, my very dear Prince, do not massacre my song in honoring me by singing it yourself. Leave that care to my cousin, who will give it its full value. Love her for me, and tell her I shall go to Brussels, on my head if necessary, to see her. You must love me, both of you. And I think that's the end of the letter. Yes, that would be the end of the letter. And we have another footnote here. In order to elucidate this paragraph, we must explain that the prince sang dreadfully out of tune, and that the pretended cousin was the lovely angelic de Hanter, daughter of the director of the theatre of Brussels. She sang beautifully and was very intelligent. The prince was madly in love with her at that time. And so I think the summation of his letter-writing abilities was entirely correct. That was an excellent and very entertaining letter. And I do wonder whether his letters themselves have been published, whether I can go out and find a collection of his letters and read them for myself. The Queen was an object of devotion to the Prince de Ligne, who could see the unfortunate Marie Antoinette without adoring her. He writes 30 years later. I only realized it the day she said to me, "My mother is displeased at your remaining so long at Versailles. Go and spend some days at your post. From thence write letters to Vienna, in order to show where you are, then come back." Such kindness, such delicacy on her part, and still more the idea of having to spend a fortnight without seeing her, drew tears from my eyes, but the charming heedlessness which preserved her from all coquetry prevented her noticing my emotion. As I do not believe in a passion which cannot be reciprocated, a fortnight was sufficient to cure me of a sentiment I now admit for the first time, and which, for fear of ridicule, I never should have confessed to anyone else. Have I ever seen in her society anything that did not bear the impress of grace, kindliness, and good taste? She intuitively knew an intriguer miles off, and hated every kind of deceit. That is why she preferred the society of the Polignacs and their friends, that is to say, Valentine, Esterhazy, Besenval, Vaudreuil, Ségur, and myself. If the prince worshipped the queen, on the other hand, he had little esteem for the king. He writes, "The king, in whom I hope to find some good qualities, whom it may be said I have protected, whose mind I have endeavoured to elevate by interesting discourses, instead of his hunting topics or idiotic conversation, cares for nothing but tomfoolery. His practical jokes are always aimed at Conflans, Connie, or the Polignacs' friends. The queen has managed to cure him of this habit. It was at bedtime that his majesty liked to worry us. He possessed, however, a certain tact in the midst of his rough jokes. One day, when he was threatening us with his blue ribbon, which he tried to throw at someone's head, the Duc de Laval withdrew. The king said, 'Do not fear, monsieur, it has nothing to do with you.' Conye, the eternal fault finder, said to me one day, "Would you like to know what these three brothers are? A fat locksmith, the wit of a country public house, and a street fop." The two last epithets applied to Monsieur and the Count d'Artos. When the prince returned to Belle-Île, he delighted his youthful daughter-in-law with these tales, for although she liked Flanders fairly well when not there alone with her mother-in-law, she could not help regretting Paris when her husband's duties recalled him to the army, and her fickle father-in-law went off to his incessant travels. It will be remembered that the Dowager Princess had absolutely refused to consent to a residence in Paris during the winter months. She was right, for although the officers generally returned to their respective capitals during the bad season, the military profession did not allow much leisure time, and Prince Charles, being in the Austrian service, would scarcely have been able to spend his leave in Paris. The young princess would therefore have been left to the care of an aunt who had no authority over her, or to that of a father-in-law more absorbed in amusing himself than acting as a mentor to his daughter-in-law. This delicate and dangerous position had naturally alarmed the Princess de Ligne, but Helene had not much foresight. The pleasure she anticipated of appearing in the brilliant society of which she had only just caught a glimpse outweighed any feeling of prudence, and she quite hoped to obtain her husband's consent in the matter. And you have to admit, this sounds like the beginning of a Balzac novel. In fact, I think I've read a novel or a short story novella by Balzac with exactly this premise, where the young wife is let out into society in Paris without enough supervision, and as a result, she is susceptible to the advances of young men and ends up having an affair. The first step consisted of her presentation at court. Helene had gained an ally in her aunt, the princess, who was quite ready to conduct her pretty niece to Versailles, but the latter wished to make her appearance there with all the honours of war, that is, with those of the tabouret. And tabouret is in italics with a footnote for us, to have the right of sitting down in the king or queen's presence. And I would assume you would have to be of a quite high status to be allowed to sit in the presence of the king or queen. This could only be obtained by virtue of certain rights. The rank of Grande of Spain was a sufficient title. The Prince de Ligne possessed this rank, and Helene persuaded her husband to ask the prince to make it over to him. Such a request was not a small affair. The young prince was rather embarrassed, the more so that this request would entail another, that of a grant of money. Magnificent costumes and jewels, etc., had absorbed the largest part of the young couple's income. However, incapable of refusing any wish of his wife's, Prince Charles took heart and decided upon writing. He immediately received from his father, who was then at Versailles, the most charming reply. "Is it not, my dear Charles, a droll thing to be married? You will manage to get on, for after all, one is bound more or less according to circumstances. It is only fools who do not know how to turn the position to account. Meanwhile, you have a very pretty little wife, whom, without false shame, you may love. Although from father to son we have been called Lamoral without knowing whether he is a saint, I am neither moralist, nor moralizer enough to preach, and I make fun of those who do not believe in my morality, which consists in trying to make all around me happy. I feel quite sure that this is your case also, without having a whole array of principles. This is one of the 4 or 5 I have adopted as a second education. My first, as I told you, is that to be a liar or a coward would bring me sorrow to my grave. Certainly, my dear fellow, you have well understood this short lesson. And now let us come to business. Take as much money as you require. My men of business must have it or obtain it. That is one subject done with. The Queen said she will make my affair de cours. And we have a footnote here. An estate of the Prince de Ligne in France, about which he had a lawsuit. The name of the estate is pronounced like cours, hearts, hence the prince's pun. A success. And when I told her that my affaire de cour, love affairs, were successful, she said I was a fool. Cours settled, and that makes 2 affairs done with. Your uncle, the Bishop of Wilna, who fancies that you or I may some day be King of Poland, wants us to obtain the indignat. indignat, I-N-D-I-G, E accent aigu, N-A-T. We shall get it. That is another affair terminated. Our aunt of the Tuileries wants your wife to have the tabouret. She has a fancy for going to Versailles, and for that purpose wishes me to cede you the grandezza. I have already written to the King of Spain and to the minister on the subject, and have spoken of it to the ambassador. Fourth affair concluded, leaving me the prospect of taking cold by being obliged to get down at the gates of the court, where only the coaches of the grandees of Spain are allowed to enter, as in the Luxembourg and elsewhere. Here are two sources of economy for me. The King's Play, the coucher, which no longer costs me anything. What annoys me is to hear clever people say foolish things, to hear war discussed by idlers who have never seen anything but military exercises, and those badly done, disinterestedness proclaimed by women who manage to get pensions by dint of tormenting the ministers and the Queen, who is 1,000 times too kind, to hear sensibility professed by those who have had at least 20 lovers. And then the intriguers, the obtrusive, the wicked. How often this makes my blood boil. But a quarter of an hour later, I forget it all. Shall I tell you a foolish saying of mine, considered as much by all the royal family? You know that at the town theatre I am under the King's box, amongst the public. You will remember the mirror in La Fausse Magie. La Fausse Magic? I think that's a typo there. That should be a C instead of an E. La Fausse Magique. A comic opera by Gretry. Or maybe it is an E. I can't tell. It's in italics. I think it's meant to be an E. La Fausse Magie, which would track with the French. At the close of the play, it was dreadfully cold, and the King complained of it, as well as of the coldness of the acting. I said, it is because the denouement is à la glace, and à la glace means on ice. Or we have a footnote here. There is a double meaning here. I know glace as in ice, but apparently in French it means either ice or looking glass. That's a bit of a sharp tongue. The brothers hooted me out loud for this pun. This existence at Versailles is delightful. It is like life in a country house. I embrace your wife and your mother for having had wit enough to make me a Charles like yourself. P.S. by the by, I had already planned in my head a grove for my Charles, a fountain that will bear the name of Helene, and a bower for their children. I shall work at it as soon as I leave Versailles to go and tell you tutti quanti, T-U-T-T-I, space Q-U-A-N-T-I, that I love you with all my heart. And that is another excellent letter. That actually brings us to the end of the chapter. But so far, this volume is just kind of proof that letter writing is kind of a lost art. Letters were once something that, people took great care and pride in crafting. And I don't think they are in any way comparable to, the sort of email we would send today, because no one tries to be literary or poetic in their emails, at least no one I know. But back when you would, send your letter by post, and correspondence and travel were a lot slower, and you might not see people as often, it was the fashion to develop highly stylized letters and a talent at letter writing. But as I said, here we are at the end of chapter 5. That was quite a long one. We're almost at 40 minutes here. But I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed the couple of letters that were interspersed in there. And I'll see you again next time with chapter 6.